Right, thank you very much. Those were two very interesting presentations on a matter about which I can't find anything to disagree, because after all, we all are beginning to understand the extent of the environmental problem, the fact that it is a worldwide problem, and the difficulties of making any individual contribution to its solution. So what I was proposing to do was to reflect a little bit more on the motives that we all individually have for taking the environment seriously, and how, in general, we should relate to it, and in particular, how we should relate to the landscapes in which we situate ourselves. And I think this is only tangentially related to the question of sustainability, but in the long run, I think, is a part of that question. And it's to do, of course, with making and conserving a home for ourselves. And I have three broad thoughts here: one philosophical, one phenomenological, and one psychological. The philosophical thought is this. Pasquale this morning asked an interesting question. How and why does land become a landscape? And there's a very similar question to that, which is, how and why does a human being become a person? You might think these are very different questions on the surface, but in my view, they are very closely related. That there's a kind of relationship between us which enables us to transfigure the human body into the picture of the human soul. And that creates the possibility of seeing each other in a completely different way, as free beings with each with a subjectivity of his own, relating to each other through moral and religious and aesthetic ideas. And something similar happens in our relation to the land when we begin to see it as a landscape. It's as though it started looking back at us with something like the point of view that a person has when a human being looks back at us properly. So there's a kind of relationship with the land which generates a new kind of thing, the landscape. This is what philosophers would call an intentional kind and not a material kind. And there are landscapes, there are also seascapes and cloudscapes. And all three, I think, were born for us in Western civilization at the moment when outer and inner came into correspondence, when the earth, the sea, and the sky, and all the rest of nature were no longer seen as objects to be struggled against, but as fellow subjects, so to speak, in relation to us, that we're not standing against them as something completely different, but that we are relating to them as our home and as the things which partially identify us as what we are. In the previous talk, in Judith's talk, well, it was principally, I suppose, my thoughts about Judith's talk. We came across the concept of the pilgrim. The pilgrim I see as somebody crossing spaces which are objects, in order to arrive at the unique subject space that is his goal. The place of martyrdom, or the place that had been visited by God, as in Judith's pictures of the Mount Sinai. The sacred place is a place which, as it were, has its own subjectivity. God himself made this clear to Moses when Moses confronted him in that place and asked for the identity of the thing that shone upon him from the burning bush, and that thing replied, "I am that I am." In other words, I'm giving you no information about myself except that I am a subject like you. And that sort of sense of the pilgrim as the person who's crossing the world of objects in order to find the place where subjectivity has revealed itself, I think is a very important part of our spiritual inheritance. But when we come to the Romantic movement, of which Andreas was speaking so well, the pilgrim becomes a wanderer. And the wanderer is not somebody who's on a pilgrimage to find God. He's someone who's mislaid God. He's seeking him everywhere and could find him anywhere. There's no specific place where God is, and he's certainly not outside this world either. So we have a new attitude to the landscape, which is born of Romanticism. And I think that's really in the back of our minds, and it's in the back of many of the motives that promote people to do what Luke did in his film, and to present nature as a place in which we are, as it were, wanderers in search of our own deeper relation to it. My second thought was phenomenological. It takes off from something that Jakob said yesterday about boundaries and the fact that we need boundaries in order to understand our world as a place where we ultimately are, a place which is ours. I think this is true that landscapes we wish to see in the end as bounded in some way, as places. I think John Burnside referred to this as well, the transition from a space to a place. A place is something which has boundaries, somewhere where there's a beyond which doesn't belong to it. Sea and sky are not like that, though perhaps truly maritime people like the Venetians do see the sea more as a bounded place. I mean, they've done their best to bound it. But we live in a world where actually boundaries are being lost. And Noni's excellent presentation of virtual reality put great emphasis on the new idea of the 360-degree camera, the Google vision of the world, which erases boundaries, because the actual seen world is a world without boundaries. And this is extremely interesting because the visual field actually is limited. And there are lots of things that I don't see at the moment, but there is no edge to my visual field. That's an extraordinary phenomenon, that we live in in our visual world. We live in a world which is limited, but it has no boundaries. One of the things that we try to do in settling down and making a home for ourselves is to create that boundary, and we also try to give a boundary to nature through art. A painting of a landscape gives it an edge and a frame, and that's to say it brings things into finite relation with each other so that they balance, so that they have an order and a discipline. And I think that's one of the reasons why landscape painting became so important during the Romantic movement. It was, as it were, transference into the realm of art of a fundamental gesture of home building, of putting an edge around things. And our English landscape painting is particularly important in this connection. The landscape appears not in the background, as in Raphael's Virgins and so on, but in the foreground, and indeed in Constable, the human figures are background, not foreground. So landscapes emerge from these boundaries, and we acquire a need to protect the boundary and make it into a shared possession. And I think that's one of the primary movements in our protection of nature. We don't think quite so globally as perhaps we ought to do, but what we do, we are inspired by the thought that within this place which is ours, we ought to be at least protecting the boundary. The National Trust in Britain arose, well, it's the English National Trust actually, arose in the end of the 19th century through the work of certain disciples of John Ruskin, who, and their first concern was to protect the seashore. This is the common boundary of our island, and it mustn't be polluted and made and uglified. This is the place where our home comes to an end, and as it were, is elided into the boundless ocean. So that was the first major environmental movement in our country, anyway. My third thought was about a psychological thought about landscapes and their relation to home. What the pilgrim and the wanderer both have in common is, of course, that they are not at home. We're wandering, but the pilgrim has a goal. The wanderer doesn't have a goal. He might stumble across it. But what distinguishes them is that the wanderer has lost a home. And if he is to find it, he must find it in this world or not at all. Going back to Andreas's agenda, I think the greatest work of art which expressing the wanderer idea is Schubert's Winterreise, the song cycle describing, evoking, expressing the moments in the steady desolation of a human soul who has looked for made a stab at getting a home of his own and failed, and has turned out into the winter landscape, and seeing reflected in all the works of nature his own alienation from it, and finally joining that quintessential wanderer, the lyreman, the organ player. Right, so the pilgrim is seeking the place in time that is visited by the eternal. He is not in poignant opposition to the places through which he wanders, though maybe that should be qualified a little. When Byron wrote Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, he didn't mean pilgrimage, I guess. He meant wanderer, his wandering. But interesting enough, all the places that Childe Harold wanders to are places that are made holy by other people's gods. They're places where people store their gods, so to speak. And that's perhaps one of the ways in which wanderers can keep hold of the world, as Byron did. But other people's gods are usually looked after by other people's women, for whom Byron didn't have an enormous amount of respect. So there we are. Those are my thoughts about where we are. I suppose my concern is how we use these conceptions that I think are integral to our self-identity as modern people. You know, our desire for boundaries, our sense of ourselves as in some way wandering, and our longing for home. How do we use those to create a motive that we can all share, which will enable each of us to do his own little bit of work? Because these big schemes are probably beyond us. The Czechs always say that there is no solution except drobná práce, small-scale work, and that's all that they've ever done. And you might say that's why they got into such trouble. But nevertheless, small-scale work is better than no work at all. So I would recommend that way of seeing things that I've been outlining, and I hope that we can all come together to protect our own little bounded sense of home.
I really much enjoyed what I've heard and seen, but I want to pick up on Roger's point about the personification of land, turning it into landscape. I think that's a beautiful notion, and obviously a very profound one. But actually, things carry on after it has been personified. First of all, it becomes then property. It becomes usually somebody else's property. It is, as it were, worked. It is something that has to, as it were, generate an income, and so on and so forth. And I think it's for that sort of reason, and the fact that landscapes, the property ownership of landscapes is so widely distributed, and the consequence of that although I'm instinctively attracted to your notion of sorting it all out at home and in small scale and so on, the fact remains is we do need cooperation at quite a high level in order that our relationship to landscape should be the beautiful, non-pathological one that you envisage in the notion of the landscape being personified.
Yeah, I entirely agree that none of this makes sense without a properly modulated legal order, which will prevent abuse of the landscape by adverse forms of property and all the rest. Ownership is not a violation of the land, however. You know, this little island on which we are fortunately situated was made into the human thing it is by ownership. But it was ownership which was also a form of dedication, because of course that's what a monastery is. And I think that what our English landscape painters were trying to convey was a landscape in which ownership had also consecrated the land. It wasn't a form of merely instrumental reasoning, so to speak.
And I entirely agree with that, and I have no principled objection to ownership. There's always a question of who owns. And if you have a sort of Monsanto scale ownership of all sorts of across the globe, then I think you've got a real problem. If I look across any landscape in England, I have an idea that I have no idea who owns much of it. But I have a suggestion that probably much of my own country, as it were, is owned by people who don't necessarily have either the well-being of my country or indeed the well-being of the planet at stake. So that's in the sense why I'm with you on ownership, but not on the actual ownership that we have at the moment.
I've always taken the view that ownership of the land is okay as long as it's mine. I've spent my last 20 years trying to put that into practice. I've got up to 105 acres now, but it doesn't compare with James Dyson's 100,000 or whatever. You're absolutely right. I think that one of the great enemies of not just of the landscape but of the land is the absentee owner, and it's not the quantity of Monsanto's property that matters so much as the fact that there is no such person as Monsanto, and nobody who is hurt by the land that Monsanto owns when he sees it being violated. So yeah, we need to recognize that ownership has duties as well as rights, and one duty is to reside there.
So I have no doubt that you look after your 100 or so acres, I think you said, very well. But you know, being a global citizen and traveling around the world, unfortunately, not everyone is as wise as you are. And I do think that at some part of the planet, that's why I was talking about the objective of protecting, even from individuals, a considerable part that just needs to be protected. And this sounds like I have no faith in my fellow human beings, but there's many of us, and there are many of us who are starving, and many of us who want to make money, like Monsanto, for example, and therefore we're treating the land that we own, whether we're individuals, our companies, our cities, our governments, in a way that's just not going to provide the services that we will need. So we need to find some sort of a good compromise between your philosophy and mine. I said that I see the glass half full, but I am also a realist that we need some help. And you agreed with me in one of your points when you said we do need some sort of a wise legal framework. Now, this doesn't look very possible today as we open our newspapers and we see the leadership that's in place, but we just need to be sure to educate our children and their children so that they see that this is global commons. And I think we need to start looking at the planet as our common home. And therefore I think we need to try to figure out a way to share it in an equitable way. Again, you know, there are millions of people and billions of people who have nothing. And that's unacceptable as far as many of us are concerned, I think. So how do we bring about that new form of governance? It's a big challenge.
Yes, I used to go in places where there is no owner, so it's a bit different point of view, but it's interesting because if you go on the human spacey point of view, you feel that it's a common good. The problem for me is to find the scale of good policy to say we must share, or we must find a fair way to protect everything. Just give you an example. When I was in the primary forest in Peru, I was in contact with local people, with aborigines, and some trees around us were more than 20, more than 200,000 euros. And who I am to say to these local people, you don't have to cut this tree, because this tree is very important for the common destiny of the human. And this is the same for the polar region. This is the same for the ocean as well. And for me, the main problem now is for this kind of ownership. We will probably have to go out of the boundaries, to go at the spacey level, to have like a common brain, to say, okay, if I'm speaking at the level of humanity, we have to take care of everything. But if we go in that direction, we are breaking all the rules, because we are breaking all the local problems. We are breaking the UN as well. So for me, this is a very big challenge.
Well, now I'm not sure if I'm just stating the obvious, and I still have the microphone, but I can't help but wonder. I do understand that the concept of ownership gives you some sort of investment in taking care, theoretically, in taking care of your land, but I feel like that might be sort of part of the problem that got us here, and that this idea that we own nature and that it's ours, and that therefore, you know, if there's empty nature, that we can go and own it, and we can put a pipeline in it if we have enough money in it to do that. And I can't help but wonder if there's anything that we could discuss of ways of changing the mentality to stewardship from ownership, because how can you say that you own tree that's 300 years old? You know, like, who owns that? That tree doesn't think you own it. And like, then you say, I own it, I can cut it down. I feel I would love to hear how, if there's anything you could say on changing the mentality that kind of got us into this situation in the first place.
So that's a great question, Alison. I mean, I refer to the fact that there are people thinking about rethinking the economic system which drives our societies, the GDP, and the whole idea of paying for the services of nature, payment for ecosystem services, paying for the stewards of the nature, paying that indigenous person a fair share of protecting that tree, because a tree is not only interesting for his community, but it's interesting for all of us. Paying the people in the Amazon, which when I first used to go to the Amazon, I had no idea. I just thought it was beautiful. Now I go there and I feel like I'm in a cathedral. Those trees are breathing for me on the other side of the ocean. So I think that the economic discussions about rethinking the economic basis, paying for the stewardship, I think it's something that we need to get involved in. And I just want to say that, you know, the entire world, and I'd be glad to have a discussion over a big drink about the UN system, for example, our governance system, set up 70 years ago in a totally different world. We need to have the courage to really try to change that, and it's not easy, obviously. Those people love to live in New York and Paris and Rome, and so, but that's another discussion. But all the governments of our planet, 196 of them, agreed on these goals for what they call sustainable development, which is another term that most people on the street have no idea what it means. But the definition is to think beyond our passage through our life here on planet Earth. I liked the way a British former ambassador to the UN defined it as sustainable development, treating the earth as if we intended to stay. And think about how you know, when you own your own home, you intend to stay at least until the end of your life, and you treat it, you're very careful when we're passing through. I didn't make my bed this morning, and it looks terrible because this wasn't really my room. I should have made it, but that's not such a big harm. But anyway, treating the earth as if we are intending to stay, just changing their mindset about our role on this planet, our only home, and we're just here for increasingly longer time, but still we're not going to be here forever. And some of us have children and grandchildren. But we really have to look at us as a part of the human family, if possible, and rethink the economic basis, rethink the way we're organizing our global governance. That takes courage and it's a lot of work, but I think it has to be done.
Only one remark, really, which is that we do have, I mean, different countries have different legal provisions, but we do have laws and regulations in Europe, and especially in Britain, which prevent people from doing things like cutting down an old tree. But if you told a farmer that he can't cut down an old oak tree which is worth £2,000 as timber, you have effectively stolen £2,000 from him, and that might be absolutely necessary, that £2,000 to him. So there has to be compensation, and I think one of the things that everybody has got wrong is the whole issue of subsidies to farmers and subsidies to rural people generally, which are conceived as though they were being paid to produce their crops or not produce them sometimes, whereas in fact the real reason for subsidizing farmers is to compensate them for not doing with the landscape what they might do to make it profitable. You know, in Britain you're not allowed to build in the countryside at all. You can if you get special planning permission, but you know that's a huge cost to the farmers. That's the only asset they have is their land, and they're not allowed to use it for its its sole commercial value. So, I think getting the whole business of compensation right, and that applies to third world nations as well, obviously, even more so. I think that anyway. That's just an answer to your worry to some extent.
Maybe it's important maybe to do things. It's interesting to go in the tree's point of view because you will have a consideration of the time absolutely different. And when, like a big tree in the tropical forest, you are living for 8 centuries, you can maybe support that people are crazy during 25 or 50 years because it means nothing. So it's drive us to consider the problem in our point of view, because for the trees, because for the planet itself, there is no subject. There is absolutely no problem. And it drives me to the other remarks. There is a lot of things when we are talking about the nature which are out of the power of the money. If you want to rebuild the forest, and if you have no more seeds, if you have no more animals to transport the seeds, you can do everything you want. It doesn't work because it's clearly impossible. And now I think that we have to consider this power. What are we able to rebuild or not? And for me, this is a very interesting border in matter of every decision we could take for the future.